Ethan Cole had learned a long time ago that a phone ringing before sunrise never brought good news. So when his cracked screen lit up at 5:52 in the morning with a number he didn't recognize, his stomach dropped before he even answered. If you have ever raised a child alone, if you have ever laid awake wondering how you would pay for one more hospital bill, one more school trip, one more pair of shoes that fit, then stay with me, because what happened to Ethan next could happen to anyone, and the choice he made in the end is the reason 500,000 people have already watched this story and refused to look away. If it moves you the way it moved me, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe before we go any further, because you are not going to want to miss how this ends. Ethan was 38 years old, and for the last 6 years, he had been both mother and father to his daughter Lily. His wife Sarah had died of a sudden aneurysm when Lily was only 2, leaving him with a toddler, a mortgage, and a job as a mechanic at Denny's Auto on the edge of a small town called Millbrook. He was not rich. He was not important. He drove a truck with 190,000 miles on it and wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, and every single night, without fail, he came home smelling like motor oil and sat at the kitchen table to help his 8-year-old daughter with her homework before making her a grilled cheese sandwich, because it was the only thing she would reliably eat. What the town didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Lily had a congenital heart defect. She had been born with a hole between 2 chambers of her heart, and while surgery when she was 4 had repaired most of the damage, she needed regular checkups, medication, and one more procedure down the line that her father's insurance would only partially cover. Ethan had a folder in his kitchen drawer, thick with medical bills, that he did not let himself look at more than once a month, because looking at it too often made his hands shake. The call that morning was from a law office in the city, 40 minutes away. A woman with a crisp, professional voice introduced herself as Patricia Nguyen, attorney for the Hale family, and asked if Ethan Cole could come to Riverside Memorial Hospital that afternoon. When Ethan asked why, all she would say was that Richard Hale had personally requested his presence, and that it concerned a matter of, in her words, considerable urgency and considerable value. Ethan almost hung up. He assumed it was a scam, the kind of thing you read warnings about on community bulletin boards. But the name Richard Hale stopped him cold. Everyone in the region knew that name. Hale Industries owned the manufacturing plant that employed nearly a third of Millbrook, including several of Ethan's closest friends. It also funded the pediatric wing at Riverside Memorial, the very wing where Lily had her surgery 4 years earlier, the wing that had waived nearly $11,000 of their bill that Ethan could never have paid on his own. He remembered that day too, not because anyone ever told him the details, but because on the morning of Lily's surgery, Ethan had done something he never spoke about to a single soul. He had been driving past the old county bridge before dawn, on his way to an emergency shift, when he saw a car half submerged in the creek below, its headlights flickering under black water. He didn't think. He pulled over so fast his truck nearly went into the ditch, and he was down the embankment before his own brain had finished processing what his eyes were seeing. The water at the bottom of the bank was so cold, it felt like a hand closing around his chest, squeezing the air out of his lungs. Before he'd taken 3 steps into it, he could hear screaming from inside the car, high and panicked, a young voice calling for anyone, please, anyone. The current was already pulling the vehicle's rear end deeper, tilting the whole frame at an angle that told Ethan, with the flat certainty of a man who fixed cars for a living, that it had maybe 90 seconds left before it slid the rest of the way under. He waded in without a plan, without a rope, without anything but the fact that a kid was trapped, and he happened to be the only person on that road, at 5 in the morning. The window was already shattered on one side, and he reached through broken glass that opened a long cut across his forearm he wouldn't tell. And fart, to long and sense, the cut des apodis, the two'd even notice, until hours later, found a seatbelt buckle, with fingers gone half numb from the cold, and hauled a teenage girl out through the gap by the collar of her jacket, just as the car's back end dropped, and the whole thing slid beneath the black water, with a sound like a held breath, finally let go. He carried her up the embankment, wrapped her in his own jacket, because hers was soaked through, and sat with her on the wet grass until she stopped shaking hard enough to speak. She never gave her name, and neither did he. He called it in from her phone, waited only long enough to hear sirens in the distance, and then he left, because his own daughter was being wheeled into surgery 2 hours later, and nothing else in the world mattered to him that morning. He never learned who she was. He never told anyone what he'd done. Not Denny at the shop, not his own mother, not a single soul in Millbrook. It simply became one more thing that happened, in a life that was already too full of things happening, filed away in the back of his mind, next to 100 other, exhausted, half-remembered mornings. That afternoon, dressed in the cleanest shirt he owned, Ethan walked into a hospital room on the highest floor of Riverside Memorial, the kind of room with a private nurse and a view of the whole valley, and found an old man propped up against a mountain of pillows, tubes in his arms, oxygen hissing quietly beside the bed. Richard Hale was 71 years old and dying of pancreatic cancer, and everyone in that room, including Richard himself, knew he had weeks left, not months. "Mr. Cole," Richard said, his voice thin but sharp, the voice of a man who had built an empire out of stubbornness. "Do you know why I asked you here?" Ethan shook his head slowly, standing near the door like he wasn't sure he was allowed to sit. 4 years ago, Richard said, a stranger pulled my daughter out of a car that was sinking in Miller's Creek. He never gave his name. The police report said a passing driver called it in and left before they arrived. It took my private investigator 3 years and an enormous amount of money to identify you, because you did not want to be found. That tells me something about a man's character, Mr. Cole. It tells me more than any resume ever could. Ethan felt the floor tilt slightly under him. "I didn't do it to be found," he said quietly. "I did it because there was a kid in a car, and nobody else was there." "I know," Richard said, and for a moment something in the old man's eyes softened into something almost like grief. "That is exactly why I asked for you." Then Richard told him the rest, and the room went very still. Richard's will, drafted decades earlier under different circumstances, contained a clause his own lawyers had begged him to remove for years, and he never had. A clause requiring his only child, his daughter Emma, to be married before his estate could pass to her directly. If she was not married at the time of his death, control of Hale Industries, along with the pediatric wing funding, the worker pension trust, and nearly every charitable commitment the family had ever made, would revert to a distant cousin named Corbin Hale, a man who had made no secret of his plans to sell the plant to overseas investors and gut the hospitals, charitable programs, to fund a luxury development instead. "I am not asking you to love my daughter," Richard said, watching Ethan's face carefully. "I am asking you to marry her, so that 4,000 jobs and a hospital wing that has saved children like yours do not disappear into Corbin's pockets the week after I am buried. Marry her, Mr. Cole, or in 30 days, this town loses everything it has left." Ethan sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed, his mind racing through everything that mattered to him. Lily's next appointment, the mechanics down at Denny's who had families of their own, the wing where a nurse had once held his hand while his daughter was in surgery, and told him everything would be fine. And underneath all of that, one simple, unbearable fact. He had never even met this daughter Richard was talking about. "You understand I could say no," Ethan said slowly, testing the words as they left his mouth, half expecting the old man to threaten him, the way rich men in movies always seem to threaten the people who stood in their way. "You could," Richard agreed, without a trace of anger. "And if you did, I would not blame you for a single second of it. I am asking a stranger to reshape his entire life around a decision my own cowardice created 30 years ago. That is not a small thing to ask, Mr. McCole." and I have spent every night since my diagnosis, wondering whether I have any right to ask it at all." He paused, to let a wave of pain pass, his hand tightening briefly on the blanket, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something almost gentle. "But I have also watched my daughter give away every comfort I ever tried to hand her, because she was terrified of being loved for the wrong reasons. And I have exactly one card left to play before I run out of time to fix any of it. You are that card. Not because of what you can give this family, but because of what you already proved, in the dark, in freezing water, expecting nothing back." Ethan looked out the window at the valley below, at the distant outline of the Hale Industries, plant where men he had known his whole life clocked in every morning, and thought about the Galders this same family had quietly written off 4 years ago, without ever telling him. The same week a nurse he'd never properly met held Lily's hand and told her the surgery would go fine. "Give me 2 days," he said finally. "I need to talk to my daughter before I decide anything, and I'm not signing away my life for a company I don't like first, without looking the woman in the eye first." Richard nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his tired face. "That," he said, "is exactly the answer I was hoping you would give." "I don't know your daughter," Ethan said. "I don't know anything about her. You're asking me to marry a stranger to save a company." "No," Richard said, and for the first time, he smiled, faint and tired, but real. "I already know you've met her. You just don't realize it yet." 2 days later, Ethan sat in the small waiting room of the pediatric cardiology wing, waiting for Lily's quarterly checkup, half convinced the entire hospital meeting had been some fevered dream, brought on by exhaustion and grief. That was when a woman in pale blue scrubs walked in holding Lily's chart, glanced up, and stopped mid-step. "You," she said softly, staring at him, the way you stare at a ghost. "You're the man from the bridge." Her name was Emma Hale, and she had spent the last 4 years working as a pediatric nurse under her mother's war's maiden name, refusing every privilege her father's fortune could have bought her, because she wanted to know, just once in her life, that people were kind to her, for reasons that had nothing to do with money. She had held Lily's small hand through 2 of her checkups over the past year. She had brought her stickers. She had never once connected the quiet, tired mechanic in the corner of the waiting room to the stranger who vanished from the edge of a creek 4 years earlier. The one detail from the worst night of her life that she had never been able to let go of. They stood there for a long moment, both of them stunned into silence, while somewhere down the hallway, a nurse called the next patient's name, and the ordinary business of the hospital carried on around them, indifferent to the fact that fate had just closed a circle, 4 years in the making. For a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Emma set Lily's chart down on the counter, with hands that weren't quite steady, and Ethan found himself, absurdly, noticing the same faint scar along her hairline that he remembered from the ambulance lights 4 years earlier, the one detail that had stayed lodged in his memory longer than he ever admitted to himself. "I used to come back to that bridge sometimes," Emma said quietly, "just to sit there. I never even knew what you looked like in daylight. I used to think I made you up, honestly. A stranger who shows up out of nowhere and vanishes before you can even say thank you. Sounds like something out of a story, not something that actually happens to real people." "Your father wants us to get married," Ethan finally said, because there was no gentler way to say it, and he had never been a man for gentle lies. Emma's face went through something complicated. Embarrassment, anger, and underneath it all, something that looked almost like relief. "He told you about the will," she said, sitting down across from him, suddenly looking much younger than her 29 years. "I begged him for 10 years to change it. He always said he would, and he never did. And now there isn't enough time left to fix it the right way. So what do you want?" Ethan asked her, and it was, he realized later, the first time in the entire ordeal that anyone had actually asked her that question, instead of telling her what she was required to do. Emma looked at Lily's chart in her hands, at the little girl's careful crayon drawing of a heart taped to the front of it, and then back at Ethan. "I want the hospital wing to stay open," she said. "I want the plant workers to keep their jobs. I want my father to die in peace instead of terrified about what happens after. And I want," she added, quieter, "to never again be some story people tell about a rich girl who got saved and never even thanked the man who did it." That night, Ethan sat on the edge of Lily's bed while she traced the stitching on her quilt with one finger, the way she always did when she was working up the courage to ask something. "Are you going to marry the nurse lady?" she finally asked, not looking up. Ethan had learned, in 6 years of raising her alone, that Lily's quiet questions were always the ones that mattered most, so he didn't answer right away. He thought about the plant workers he'd known his whole life, about Denny, who had a boy with autism and needed the good insurance the company provided, about the folder of medical bills in his kitchen drawer that this decision could erase in an instant if he let it, and about the fact that none of that was the real reason forming in his chest. "I think so," he said finally. "But not because anybody's making me, because I think she might be one of the good ones, and good ones are rare, and I don't mean to be the guy who let a good one slip by because he was scared of what people would say." Lily considered this with the seriousness only an 8-year-old can manage, then nodded once, decisively, the way she approved of a new brand of cereal. "Okay," she said, "but she has to still let me pick the stickers." Ethan promised her she would, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in years. Word of the arrangement reached the rest of the Hale family within a week, and it did not go over quietly. Corbin Hale, the cousin who stood to inherit everything if the wedding never happened, showed up at the family estate uninvited, furious, calling Ethan a con man and a fortune hunter in front of Richard's entire household staff. He hired a private detective of his own within days, certain there had to be some scheme, some angle, some reason a broke mechanic would agree to marry into one of the wealthiest families in the state. He found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Ethan had not asked for a single dollar. He had not asked for a prenuptial exception, a signing bonus, or a guaranteed inheritance. In fact, when Richard's lawyer, Patricia Wynne, sat him down to draft the marriage agreement and slid across a document outlining a 7-figure trust in his name, Ethan pushed it back across the table without opening it. "I don't want the money," Ethan said. "I want it written into the contract, in plain language, that every cent of my inheritance from this marriage goes straight into the worker pension fund and the pediatric wing's endowment. I want the plant kept open under American ownership for at least 20 years. I want Emma to keep her nursing job if she wants it, no strings attached. And I want it understood, right now, in this room, that if Emma and I don't fall in love the way real married people do, I will never touch a cent of this family's money, not for me, and not for my daughter. Lily and I have gotten by on nothing for 6 years. We can keep doing it." Patricia Wynne, who had drafted marriage agreements for oil families and old money for 22 years, later, told a colleague, it was the only contract negotiation of her career where the groom tried to give money away instead of asking for more. Corbin's lawyers tried to challenge the arrangement twice in those 11 days. First by claiming Ethan was mentally unfit to waive a fortune of that size, and then by claiming Richard himself was too medicated to have arranged the meeting that started it all. Both challenges collapsed within 48 hours. The first because 3 separate doctors confirmed Ethan understood exactly what he was signing, and the second because Richard, summoning strength nobody expected him to still have, gave a videotaped deposition from his hospital bed, so lucid and so cutting that Corbin's own attorney reportedly advised him to drop it before a judge lost patience with the family entirely. Emma, for her part, found herself fielding a different kind of pressure. Calls from cousins and family friends who wanted to know if this was some kind of publicity stunt to make the Hale name look generous before the old man died, and reporters from 2 regional papers who staked out the hospital parking lot hoping for a photograph of the mechanic, marrying into money. She answered exactly one interview request, from a small local paper in Millbrook, rather than the city outlets chasing the story for clicks, and used it to say only one thing worth quoting: that she had spent her whole adult life being loved for the wrong reasons, and she intended to spend the rest of it being loved, if she was loved at all, for the right ones. When Richard heard what Ethan had done, he laughed for the first time in weeks, a dry, rasping laugh that turned into a coughing fit, and told his nurse afterward, "That's the man who's going to marry my daughter. Not because he wants what's mine, because he's the only man I've ever met who didn't." The wedding took place 11 days later, in the small chapel attached to Riverside Memorial, because Richard was too weak to leave the hospital, and everyone knew, without saying it aloud, that this was likely the only ceremony he would ever see his daughter have. The room held barely 40 people, folding chairs borrowed from the hospital chapel's storage closet, a single arrangement of white lilies on the altar, because Emma said she didn't want anything more elaborate than what her father could actually see from his wheelchair near the front row. Lily, in a borrowed lavender dress 2 sizes too big at the shoulders, stood as flower girl, and refused to let go of Emma's hand the entire walk down the aisle, whispering loudly enough for the first 3 rows to hear that she'd always wanted a mom who worked at a hospital, because then nobody could ever be scared of needles again. The plant workers came, not all 4,000 of them, of course, but a delegation of 40, who had chipped in together to send flowers, and stood quietly at the back of the small chapel in their good church clothes, because word had spread through Millbrook of exactly what Ethan had planned, refused to take for himself, and there wasn't a single person among them who didn't understand what it meant for their own kitchen tables. Denny, Ethan's boss of 11 years, cried without any embarrassment at all through the entire ceremony, and later admitted he hadn't cried like that since his own wedding. Corbin did not attend, though his absence, several guests noted afterward, felt less like a snub and more like a confession. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, the chapel went silent for a long, strange moment, and then Richard Hale, propped up in his wheelchair with an oxygen line taped beneath his nose, raised one trembling hand just high enough to be seen and said, in a voice that carried further than anyone thought his lungs still had in them, "Only one objection. Somebody find this man a decent suit before the reception." The room broke into relieved laughter, and Ethan, standing at the altar in the only sport coat he owned, laughed harder than anyone. Richard Hale died 6 weeks after the wedding, with his daughter's hand in his and his new son-in-law standing quietly at the foot of the bed, holding Lily so she could see her new grandfather smile one last time. He died knowing the hospital wing was protected for 20 years by ironclad legal language. Ethan had insisted on personally reviewing line by line with Patricia Wynne until he understood every word of it. He died knowing 4,000 families in Millbrook would wake up the next morning with their jobs intact. What nobody expected, not Patricia, not Corbin, not even Ethan himself in those first uncertain weeks, was that the marriage which began as a rescue would become something neither of them had dared to hope for. Emma kept working her shifts at the hospital, still under scrubs stained faintly with the same coffee and hand sanitizer smell. Ethan came home smelling of himself, and in the evenings she sat at the same scratched kitchen table in Ethan's small house, helping Lily with homework, while Ethan made grilled cheese sandwiches for all 3 of them, because Lily had declared, with the absolute authority of an 8-year-old, that the rules still applied. Slowly, without either of them announcing it, the marriage of convenience became simply a marriage, built not on a wills clause, but on quiet dinners, late-night hospital calls, and a little girl who now had 2 parents who loved her without condition. A year later, Ethan still worked at Denny's Auto 3 days a week, because he said a man ought to keep his hands busy with honest work, and refused every offer to sit on the Hale Industries board, despite Emma's gentle insistence that he'd earned the right twice over. The pediatric wing at Riverside Memorial was renamed for Richard Hale, with a small brass plaque near the entrance that few visitors ever stopped to read, engraved with a line Emma had chosen herself. For every stranger who stops to pull someone out of the water, expecting nothing in return. 2 years after the wedding, Corbin Hale resurfaced only once more, at a shareholders' meeting, where he attempted, unsuccessfully, to challenge the pension trust, asked 20-year lockup on a technicality his own lawyers had already warned him wouldn't hold. He lost the vote by a wide margin, largely because the plant's own employees, several of whom now held board observer seats Ethan had insisted be created as part of the original agreement, showed up in numbers nobody expected and voted as one. He has not been back to Millbrook since, and Emma, when asked about him at all, only ever says that she hopes he finds something in his own life worth fighting for, the way they fought for this one. Millbrook still talks about it sometimes, in the way small towns talk about the stories that matter, not as gossip, but as a kind of quiet local legend, the tale of the single dad who was told to marry a stranger or watch an entire town lose everything, and who answered not by asking what he could gain, but by making sure everyone else kept what they already had. On the anniversary of the wedding each year, Emma still drives out to the old county bridge before her shift and stands at the railing for a few minutes, looking down at the creek that no longer scares her the way it used to, before heading in to work the same pediatric floor where she once held a stranger's daughter's hand without knowing his name. Lily, now old enough to understand most of it, tells people at school that her dad is a hero, and when they ask why, she doesn't mention the creek, or the will, or the money he gave away. She just says, simply, that he always makes sure everyone gets to keep their grilled cheese sandwiches, and somehow, to anyone who knows the whole story, that answer makes perfect sense.